And we change immediately, and I would like to move to the next panel, which is on, and by the way, let me just remind you, because you might have the impression, so many different issues. No, it's always the same issue. It's the interlinkage between migration, human trafficking, and slavery, and from different perspectives, labor, women, health, etc. So please, to the panel, we have Sylvia Hahn. She is professor and vice rector for international relations and communications of the University of Salzburg. She has long been working on migration issues. Yeah, this would be yours, and then on migration issues, and she has sometimes the feeling, over the years, you always see similar patterns. We will see if this is true and what you can tell us. Then we have at the panel over there, Ghada Jabour. She is head of the Exploitation and Trafficking in Women unit in Lebanon. So we are very pleased that you could come, that we would also link to countries outside, and it was especially also the wish of one of our partners of ACT Now to involve somebody from the so-called MENAT region. So thank you very much for coming. We have Mona Chamas. She's the director of the Comité contre l'esclavage moderne in Paris. They have long experience in working with victims of domestic servitude. We will certainly hear more about that. And we have Ruth Gavi Vermo-Mangold. She's a lot of things, but among others, she is the president of Peace Women across the globe. She's a former MP in Switzerland and of the Council of Europe, and still active in many fields. She was the rapporteur. You might remember, she was here before. She was the first rapporteur of the Council of Europe on trafficking for illegal organs. Yeah, no, on human trafficking for organ removal. So she was the first one to come forward with not just with what people tell you, but with evidence. Yeah? So thank you very much, you all, for being here. And we would like to start with Sylvia Hahn. She said, as a quote, "Migrant women have always been local and global actors, but as well also as victims of manifold exploitation." So the title is on feminization of migration and let's say the impact on human trafficking. So we will see, because feminization of human trafficking, we believe it's a very recent phenomenon. We will see it is not, probably, but we would also know what it means. It's not new, but what does it mean in order to combat it, in order to do something against it. So please.
Thank you very much, Helga, for the invitation. And I feel a little bit like an exotic person here, because I'm a historian and not an NGO or something like that, and so my paper will be a little different from the others, but probably I can inspire your ideas still. So as a historian, I also we heard already a lot of life stories. I also want to start with a story. It's my job, your story, his story, to tell you. So Milena was 17 years old when Borislav approached and started dating her. Milena was attractive by the courting of this good-looking and well-dressed young man who never got tired of promising her marriage, money, and especially a better future in the West. Milena convinced her widowed mother to allow her to accompany Borislav to find a new and wonderful life somewhere across the big ocean. Milena left her mother and her village in Eastern Europe after a couple of weeks with Borislav. Her dreams were put to an end when, after a long and exhausting journey, they arrived in Argentina.
May I just ask, when was it? Is this recently or was it years ago? Sorry.
Let me tell you.
Okay, sorry. No, but simply because...
You have you're the same impatient person like me. Instead of getting married, Milena was handed over by Borislav to an older woman who owned a house, or more explicitly, a brothel. From that day on, Milena had to work as a prostitute for the first half of years she had to pay back her travel expenses. Afterwards, she could send back some money to her mother. This story is very common. We hear it on the TV stations every day, once a week, wherever. But this story is 100 years, happened 100 years ago. And Milena was one of the 2.2 million Europeans who went to Argentina at the turn of the century. And Milena, as we know, she was not the only one who left Europe during the 19th and the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The trafficking of women, especially from poor European regions to bars and Brussels in cities and towns in newly settled regions across the Atlantic, increased enormously during the 19th century. A questionnaire in the Anno Journal databank of our National Library with the keyword Mädchenhandel, because that's also interesting that the term changed and it was called girls' trade, as the women's trafficking was then called, gives up 7,000 entries. That means in the same time period as the Western world worked to end the slave trade from Africa to the Americas, and the abolitionist movement was on a high peak, at the same time the trafficking of women, or the Mädchenhandel, increased in numbers and also in distance and became more and more a global phenomenon. For example, more than 50 million people, and I just want to, it was always said we are now at the high peak of the migration movement. We are not. For example, more than 50 million people migrated from Europe to the Americas during the long 19th century. First, it was more single men and families which dominated the migration. Over the course of the century, the proportion of female migrants increased. German states, for example, saw large numbers of women going to America because of the high demand, and now we are one of the demand questions, from the male surplus, which was a result of the male surplus there. Some communities and states even paid the costs for overseas migration, especially for poor widows and their children. This was a cheap way to get rid of so-called social problems, to get rid of poor people that communities were responsible for and who they would have to take care for financially, because this was the way in the 19th century in Europe. Klaus Bade, a German historian, called this the export of the social question. And I'm convinced that Europe would have developed in a very different way if the continent and his nations had not been able to export a huge part of the population who then found work, income, and too often stolen property in the New World. From early on, female migrants, for example from Ireland, but also from other parts of Europe, outnumbered the males. Also, it was not really discussed. It was just always said there are domestics who come from the countryside to the town and nothing else. Also, the Mädchenhandel a little bit, yeah? So, but for example, what most of the people don't know, from Austria, at the turn of the century, 1900, the proportion of women, Austrians in Egypt, there lived about 2,000, 3,000, was 63%. In Asian Turkey, 47%. In some cities, the proportion of women migrants was even far greater. In Alexandria, for example, 72%. In Cairo, 61%. In Tripoli, 60%. And in Beirut and Adrianople, 54%. these women worked in households because there was a big demand for these women as a byproduct of the construction of the Suez Channel, and the families of the technical staff, the administrators, but also a huge surplus of male were there. They came, most of them came from the hinterland of Trieste, from the poor area of Gorizia, but also from Carinthia and Canolia. And this female servant, some, and this is also very interesting, that was not discussed today, that in transition from being a domestic, getting, for example, unemployed and then ending up in a brothel is, I think, a major thing which goes through since the last 300 years, but hard to figure out. This female servant migration that began in the 1860s continued, and the last one came home in the 1970s, more than 100 years. And most of them were female family breadwinners. And this phenomenon of a female family breadwinner became very common and important during the 20th and 21st century. Since the 1940s, the number of female migrants increased even more. For example, between 1960 and 2005, from roughly 335 to 78 million. Most of the women work as housemaids, as domestic servants, as cleaning women, as caretakers, as nurses, or as sex workers in brothels. And I think this increase is the result of the growing income disparity between the richer countries and the rest of the world. And again, what we always forget, and which was not mentioned today, most or many of these women are the family supporters, the so-called family breadwinners. And it was said by somebody today, we often forget the people who stay at home and who live off these remittances the women have to send. And I once read an interview of one woman who started as a domestic, a recent one, and ended then up in a brothel, and the family was waiting for her for the remittances, and she said, "We are like a slot machine to our families," and I think that brings it really to the point. Yeah, but when we know that women get recruited voluntarily or involuntarily to places where they are in short supply. We know that regions of arrivals are cities where men greatly outnumber women and or where there's a demand for more women. And we know that women often have to support their families. They are working, they are treated as working for pin money and not accepted or paid as female family breadwinners. And I really think this is one main goal, because as long as the male breadwinner ideology, I call it as an ideology, is still existing, and this is accompanied with cheaper wage labor for women, that as long as we can't change that, women will continue to be in danger of being trafficked and exploited, and also to transit, for example, from even low-paid jobs to slave jobs. Yeah, and we also know, and this is, as a historian, I think it's depressing a little bit. We know the regions of origin, and if we look at them just in Europe, in the 19th century, it was the eastern part of Europe. It was Galicia, what is today Moravia, Romania, Ukraine. It's the same area, and I would say we look at these landscapes of poverty and nothing is changing. And we have to ask us why doesn't it change? Also, we know that since more than 100 years, women are in danger to be trafficked from there to richer nations. Also, and what is always forgotten or is easy to forget, that widows with children are always a very precarious group in a society who is eager to get sexually and financially exploited. And very interesting at the moment, we know that refugee camps, we know that from the First World War, we know that from the Second World War, we see it now that they are recruitment areas because female refugees are trapped in these camps. They are often for traders, and very often they have to sell their daughters into marriage. And the interesting is also the similar patterns with that I started of acquisitions over the centuries. False offer of a job, travel or travel, other income-generated opportunities, false marriage, sale by family, etc. So we know that we should look to give women better educations and training for broader employment possibilities. And I think this is essential. Even in European countries, the occupational opportunities are limited for a large portion of younger women and their limited education and training. And we also should fight for a female family breadwinner salary. I think this is really necessary. And the last point, and this is one thing, it's from my educational background and my experience as a teacher now for many, many decades. And looking at the political situation at the moment is that migration and trafficking, which is one part of migration, but general, the migration discourse is not a part of our common memory, not of the state memory, not of an individual memory, not of a family memory. And I think this is a crucial point, because if it's always something separate and if it's always something new, we always start at the very point of view again. And I think that is what we do at the moment. And I think if migration is not part of the education, is not in the school books, is not taught from the elementary school up till to the university, we are not going to make a step forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me say that this is also something we are specialized in. We are a platform of experts, of practitioners, of researchers, of everybody, you know. So this makes the difference also. We come from different angles and try to develop something which makes a difference in a positive way. So thank you very much. I would now invite the panelists to just to add on, to comment, whatever. Maybe I start with Gabi, because you said you said female migrants seek refuge in Europe to save their lives, and Europe seeks female migrants to save its economy. Is this the case? Just
Yes.
maybe you
it
can
is the
elaborate
case.
on that a bit.
Thank you very much for your speech. It was very good. It was good to look back in the history. So, Helga presented me as director of Peace Women Across the Globe. This has to do with the feminization of migration. At this moment, during 1 month in 30 countries, we organized together with local women organizations peace tables for the resolution 3025. The resolution says women must speak on peace negotiations in all in all countries with war or crisis. Though this is very important that women are also participating on peace discussion. But until now, no women are participating in peace discussion worldwide. Without in Philippines, in Colombia. And I had a call from Sri Lanka. They came from the peace table discussion. And she said, we also discussed during the peace table about migration. Many people from Sri Lanka are in other countries for war reasons, but also for poverty reasons and so on. And she said, we would like to have back our women from migration countries, from your countries. We would like to have back these women. We need the money of these women, but we need also the experience, and we need also the thinking and the discussion with these women. And I said, oh dear, forget it. Without the migration, we have no salads on our table, and we have no bread on the breakfast. We need your migrants. And they tell me, who cares? Who is cooking, caring, and cleaning in our houses, in our homes for elderly people, if you will have back your migrants? I know her very good, and it was a joke, and we laughed. But this is a situation. We need the migrants. We need that women are here. We need that women are doing our not so well paid work, are cleaning in the hospitals, are caring for elderly people. And this is a big problem. These women are forced to come here of war reasons. They are forced to come here of traditional reasons. They are suffering on violence against women. They are no human rights, no women rights in their countries. So they must migrate to other countries. It is a reason for her, and it is a difficult situation. So, what is to do? These women are here. They are working here. They are invisible. It is always the role of women to be invisible. We don't take care of these women. We don't see what they are doing here. If they are not here, we remark, but we don't care of these women. And this is a big problem. Many of these women are here, poor. They are not paid. They live in bad conditions, but we don't take care of it. We don't see it, and these women are not here. Are not asking us to take care. So how to act, and what is to do from our side, that we see the migration the migration, I speak about asylum seek women as asylum seeker. I speak from women as workers, as all these women who are here to live in our countries and to make work for us. Bad paid, not paid, or in bad living condition. They sent back millions of francs, of Swiss francs. They sent back in their country, and this is very welcome. But it is not normal that we let these women live in these conditions. So we organized, we have organization, a civil organization in Switzerland, and we observe the law in Switzerland, how the law of asylum and the law of migration. This is very important. We have the law in Switzerland is not very friendly for the asylum seekers and migrants. The law in Switzerland is very hard, and we observe. We have cases, and we publish these cases. We publish these cases so everybody can see what happens in Switzerland, and it is very good for media, for schools, for everywhere to look how the law is working in Switzerland.
It will be, I understood it will be translated into English, yeah, to some time, and then it will be available, yeah? We will also.
Yes, it is. We publish these brochures for this. But it is not enough only to observe. We have also, we have a big network. We go with women to the hearings. We accompany them to the hearings, and we are very strong to ask that women are asking women in the law. This is not usually, it is not normal that it's like this, but I think we have to do it and we have to ask it. So we also look in the center if the asylums, the women are in the same houses, are not in the same houses, centers as the men. Often the perpetrators of women who are victim of violence and are of forced prostitution live in the same center. It is not possible. These women are psychological. It is a shock for her, for there, and it is not normal that they live in the same building. So we ask the government, we ask the cantons to separate women and men in the center. It is very good, so women can have can be together, can discuss together, can look what happened in her life. So we also go to the parliamentarians. As a former parliamentarian, I know we can go, we vote for them. We are important to them. So we can go and we say what is to change in the law. We have to change a law in the, for example, we have not specific women's issues in the law. Women, the law is male. The law for asylum and migration is made by men, and done for men refugees. It is not a law who women cannot find. It is not possible that the law has not women related. How to say?
Yeah,
in German?
they don't find their special responses, to.
Yes, in the law. So we must change this law that women can be also. Sagt mal, wie sagt man das?
Sagt auf Deutsch was? Women can also be
Dass man
recognized.
Frauen eben auch
Yeah.
dass man die Frauen auch, dass die Frauen, das, was Frauen angetan wird, auch mit dem Gesetz abgedeckt werden kann.
That they feel also, they are also represented in law, you know,
Yes,
with their
yes,
special needs.
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it is very important. And we have also instruments, we have conventions, we have resolutions, we have a lot of instruments to implement. We have thousands of action plans. These are not implemented, these action plans. Please don't make more action plans. Implement the old action plans. It is not useful to make and remake action plans. We have to implement all these instruments and to change really the world for women refugees and women migrants.
Yeah.
Feminization is not a fake. Feminization is a reality, and feminization of migration, of poverty, of work, of anything. I think we have to stop it and to support women asylum seekers and migrants.
Thank you very much. Yeah, because I can only underline, you know, migration is different for women and men, you know. If we look at it, then it's completely different. At first sight, we might not realize, but it is, you know. For women, they are very often double exploited, you know, in double way, as women, as migrants in the labor market, etc., etc. So this is certainly important. Gada, could you said migrant domestic workers, so it's on domestic workers, migrant domestic workers are sold dreams to come to Lebanon.
Dreams, yes.
Yeah, dreams to come to Lebanon. What do you mean?
First, I'd like to say that I'm very happy to be with you today. Thank you for inviting me all the way from Lebanon. Just a few words about my organization, CAFA. We're a feminist organization working on the issue of violence against women. One of the major topics that we work on is trafficking for sexual exploitation and trafficking for domestic servitude. I'll talk about the trafficking for domestic servitude shortly. Lebanon is usually, we give it as a case study because it is a country, it is a country where we have the highest number of refugees per capita. So basically, every 3 Lebanese persons, there's 1 refugee for every 3 Lebanese persons. We're about 4 million persons, Lebanese, on the Lebanese territory, and we have 1.5 million refugees. So it's given, most of them are Syrians, and then there's 500,000 of Palestinian refugees. And we always give Lebanon as a case study for refugee situations, and it goes without saying that this situation increases the vulnerability of refugees for trafficking and exploitation. We talk a lot about sexual exploitation of Syrian women and girls, especially that 70% of the refugee population of Syrians is women, female and children. But I won't talk about this. I will talk about domestic workers because also Lebanon is given as a case study for domestic workers. We're 4 million people, but we have 200,000 female migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. So it's a huge population of female domestic workers coming mainly from Africa and Asia. And the situation in Lebanon is a bit similar to GCC countries in the sense that the whole process of recruitment, the migration process, and the employment conditions and living conditions in Lebanon are very similar to GCC country, and they're very linked. Actually, I would argue that all domestic workers, migrant domestic workers in Lebanon fall under the definition of trafficking. And I will explain why. First of all, there's a recruitment process. If we take technically the definition of trafficking, there's a recruitment process that is handled by private agencies in the origin country and in Lebanon. In both countries, the government is just not overseeing at all the looking, but not overseeing, no supervising, nor regulating the recruitment process. So it is left to private agencies to recruit and place female workers in Lebanese households. And all the way, there's a lot of abuses happening because very often the domestic worker is recruited from remote areas where there's a lot of poverty, illiteracy, where there's no contact with the agency that is in the capital. So basically, the woman does not know the name of the recruitment agency and she cannot sue them later on in case she faces any abuse. It's middlemen and sub-agents who recruit her. So that's the recruitment process. On the way to Lebanon, we see that a lot of abuses happen because many countries of origin have put a ban on Lebanon. And this is something everybody knows, that the ban is not a solution, actually it increases trafficking. So for example, Nepal has a ban on Lebanon, and Nepalese women would be smuggled into India, then from India to Lebanon. On the way, the women have reported that they face a lot of abuse. So once the recruitment process as such is abusive, and we've documented this through studies, but also through assisting hundreds of domestic workers in Lebanon. Most of the abuses are about taking money from workers, while in Lebanon, the employer has to pay everything, including recruitment fees in the origin country. So they're taking money. Workers are going into debts to come to Lebanon. They're thinking they have to pay the ticket, the flight ticket to Lebanon, so they sell lands or they go into debts to pay this, while the employer is paying as well. So there's a double profit here. They go into debts. They're very deceived about the conditions in Lebanon. I would argue that most of them know that they're coming for domestic work, but they don't know the size of the family. They're systematically deceived about the salary. It's always lower when they come to Lebanon. They don't know the legal framework, so they don't know that there's something called sponsorship system in Lebanon, and they would not be allowed to change employers whatsoever. They're trapped. They don't know about the family, the number of members of the family, what are the tasks that they are supposed to do. And sometimes they're deceived in the sense, misinformed, by saying that you'll be able to change work, you'll work only 8 hours. So they're given a nice image about the work in Lebanon. So once they arrive to Lebanon, there's the recruitment, there's the abuse of vulnerability because they're women, they're pushed by the family to come to work in Lebanon and send money, they're illiterate, they have conditions of vulnerability, they're deceived. And once they come to Lebanon, we see the beginning of exploitation in Lebanon, where money is taken from them. It is the norm that the first 3 months are withdrawn, the salary. The first 3 months of salary are withdrawn from the worker by recruitment agencies. So basically, the employer pays the salary to the recruitment agency. We see a lot of abuses happening in the employment relationship, whether long hours of work, isolation, verbal and physical abuse. Everything is documented in studies, either conducted by CAFA or other organizations. So the employment relationship as such, in general terms, is abusive. In addition to this, domestic workers are not included in the labor law because they are women. whether migrant or Lebanese, and we don't have Lebanese domestic workers, very few, it's only migrant workers, they're excluded explicitly from labor law because they are women, because it's a continuity of the task of the woman to clean, cook, iron, etc., take care of the children. That's one, which means basically that they do not benefit from any advantage or right given by the labor law. They don't have the right to unionize, they don't have the right to get the minimum wage, they're much less paid than the minimum wage. And instead of the labor code regulating their stay, what regulates their stay is something called the sponsorship system, which basically put them at the mercy of the employer. So they don't have the right to terminate the contract. We as employees have the right always to terminate the contract. They do not have the right to do so, and they're at the complete mercy of the employer. So the only option that is given to them is either to flee, to leave the house of the employer and they become irregular because the passport is with the employer, or try to escape from the balcony, and we see a lot of suicide and death happening through this way. So that's a very brief image of the domestic workers' situation in Lebanon. What I want to say is that, as it has been discussed since the morning, we need migration policy that is very gendered in this particular case. We need also to tackle the legal framework in Lebanon. We need to tackle the migration cycle from the origin country through transit and to the country of destination. And we need to tackle the demand as well. In my opinion, reducing the demand is very necessary. It has proven to be successful in sexual exploitation and prostitution. We see it in very objective assessment in Norway and Sweden. It is the right track when it comes to labor exploitation. In Lebanon, reducing, it doesn't mean that we have to put the employer in the prison, but we have to tell the employer that he or she cannot bring a worker and give her domestic work and tell her to be a paralegal person, putting needles and taking care of the health of elderly people at the house, being a nanny, walking the dog, because this is the reality in Lebanon. It's a superwoman doing all these tasks. So by reducing the demand, by putting minimum wages, by providing care by the state, such as nurseries, elderly care, etc., we automatically reduce the demand. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you for this insight. And we certainly will also have to address the recruiters, you know. I mean, we simply accept that they are there, you know, but, and we speak a lot about smugglers, but not so much looking at recruiters. And there are examples, you know. There are examples how they are could be controlled and monitored, etc. Yeah, so thank you very much. And last but not least, dear Mona Shamas, she is the, you would like to take the floor here. She's the director of the Comité contre l'Esclavage Moderne in Paris, and you do a lot of things also, but one focus is also on women in domestic servitude and supporting women to get access to justice and maybe successful access to justice. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Is it working? Oh, it's working. Okay. So, Allah. Okay, so thank you. This will give you some rest. Thank you for inviting us to this. So I'm from the Committee Against Modern Slavery. This is our name. We were created in 1994, and yes, we are mainly on social and legal counseling and support. And we have a lot of problems with the slavery definition whenever it comes in front of a judge. Sometimes we even feel that this problem, with the debate about the slavery word, is not very helpful for the victims we are accompanying when we are named Committee Against Modern Slavery, because sometimes we have like focus facing us, like this is not, this does not exist, slavery does not exist. So I will not go into this debate again. I'm just saying that this is our name. I was expecting to talk before Ghada, because in fact, my point, and Elga told me that I can go for it, was that we cannot really talk about the feminization of migration when it comes to questioning the vulnerability of a woman victim of labor exploitation. So thank you, Professor Sylvia, for this introduction and this historical view that made things easier for me, because in what we're seeing, I'm just talking about data that we have about facts, because in our daily work, we have 180% victims of trafficking for labor exploitation on the French territory or by French citizens abroad. So this is bringing our data to very specific context, which is our work in France. So just for your information, if I can do this, is that working? Ah, it's working. The victims we are supporting are coming from 45 different countries. And as you can see, most of the countries are not really the ones that are affected by the current migration crisis. Some of them maybe were in the countries counted in migration crisis few years later, but we don't really have a very direct link between the migration crisis today and the victims that we are assisting, who are victims of human trafficking for labor exploitation. So this is one. The second point is also why my sentence is questioning vulnerability of women victims of labor exploitation. Maybe this is also related to something that we have a lot in France. You heard a bit the discussions about this new law on criminalizing the sexual exploitation and sexual demand. So this is not affecting us directly, but it's also creating a situation where focus and priorities is on very specific type of exploitation, and then all the labor exploitation is remaining invisible behind closed door. As you said, Gabi, for the domestic workers, this is true for women, but if we look at our numbers, what's happening is that this is more related to migration when it comes to the way how people got to France. This link can be more clear when we talk about men. We have just took the number of assisted victims who made the journey on their self, because most of the victims that we are assisting have been recruited in their origin country. Thus, they have been victim already when they were in their countries, and they didn't take the migration route and end up being exploited in other countries. Just to relate to what you were saying in the beginning of the day, that we have to stop thinking or excusing ourselves using human trafficking to say that we need to have harder policies against migration because we have higher risk for human trafficking and we're worried about these poor victims. This just goes with what you were saying, that this kind of policies are just making it more difficult and putting people in more vulnerable situations to enter Europe, but also inside Europe. So to go back to what I was saying, what we have in our data says first that we have more and more men who are identified as victims of labor exploitation, and among those men, more have been arrived on themselves to France. So they have been through a migration route, regular or irregular. I'm talking too, oh, sorry. Sorry for your ears. Sorry.
No.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, so where I was. Okay, so more trafficking from origin countries for women. Men are coming more on their own. The second tendency that we can talk about is, again, in our data about the victims we are assisting. So we don't have specific analysis on a global tendency. We just have some elements of information on individual cases. And this can show us that most of the cases, the exploiters are themselves organizing the travel for the victims. We have 85% of women who has been traveling through their exploiters since the beginning, when it's like 59% for men who are being brought to France with their exploiters. There's also a tendency in the number of those who arrived by plane. Just to tell you that even when we talk about regular migration, we can still end up. The link is really not so doesn't exist, at least for us. So we had like 79% who arrived by plane. So they had their visas, and the idea of the exploiter is the exploiter would organize everything and then put the migrant, the victim, put the victim in a situation where after a period of 3 months, the administrative situation becomes irregular, and this is used by the exploiter later on to put pressure on the migrant. Again, if we come to the migration policies, we are bringing people to work. At one point, they are in irregular situation, and then they end up being more vulnerable because of our migration policies, not only at the entry point, but also inside. We even had victims who were identified, who had filed in complaints at the police, and who would remain for many times with temporary permit for their stay, in a way that they cannot have a job, they cannot have an accommodation, and they end up accepting any opportunity to work or any opportunity for accommodation against services, and then they end up again in exploitation. So the migrant policies are doing in a way that even for victims that are identified, we're not making their life easy. So talking again about the modern slavery issue. Sorry, Mike, but sometimes striking people with such messages can help. We think that if we have more men becoming more visible, it's not because they are less exploited, they are more invisible, but most probably it's because their vulnerability is not really felt or seen. So most of them will wait very long period before leaving the exploiter. Some of them are getting dismissed by the exploiter themselves because they get sick, so their economic production is less to the exploiter, then he can get rid of them. We had even one case where the exploiter himself called the police to tell the police about an irregular migrant that has done something in his cleaning service to get rid of him. And the police took back the guy to the borders and back to his country after 2.5 years of exploitation. So the problem, I think, just if we look a bit in our data on this woman-male thing, is that the women maybe have more courage or a quicker kind of dynamic to react, to think, assess at one point that this is not normal, or maybe in a way or another more easy to talk to others when they ever can talk, and to formulate a problem. And I can add maybe that all of us, whenever we have a woman in a vulnerable situation facing us, we don't react in the same way. We would like very quickly to help, and we would not question the vulnerability for a woman, but we would do it for a man. Because for a man, we would look at the first beginning at the fact that he is a migrant worker coming for economic reason. I'm not talking about us here, but I'm talking about what's the reaction of the system. So whenever you have a woman in a social system, there are very quickly calls. We try to find the way to help her. The man can end up very long time in the street waiting to some help to come, because we have a problem in really assessing the vulnerability of men. And just to finish on a kind of more positive note, we'll see. Maybe not.
If there are, please.
Maybe not. I will not go through telling you stories about things that we can see yesterday or before yesterday or every day in our daily work for men or women. It's not about the gender of the migration problem, it's about the policies. So let's not go into stories, because all of them are really very difficult for anybody. So on a positive statement, I would maybe try to say that on the European level, if we want to do something, we should maybe be all for the complete implementation of the convention without any kind of excuses for anybody, and to put like very hard conditions on countries that are not respecting. I can talk about France. I will not talk about other countries. They can know. But in France, we have 30 days for reflection. Can you imagine someone who has been isolated completely with work burden, completely on his own, not speaking a word of French, to think about his situation in 30 days and decide what to do? So this is one. In the convention, we're talking about 90 days, so this shouldn't be something to discuss. It should be something just to do. The other point is to completely dissociate protection of victims from judiciary procedures. This is something that was done in France for the prostitution, the sexual exploitation. So it's possible to think about it. So let's think about it to all type of exploitation, not only one more than the others. Because all exploitations, and this is what you were just saying in the session before, all exploitations are very hard to live. So why we need to go through the judiciary system all the time? If the victim is not ready, or the victim, like the ones who arrive from Lebanon to France, and they run away when they are in France, not only from Lebanon, we have a lot of Ethiopian or Philippines coming from other countries, and they run away in Europe. They don't even know that they are in France. They know about Europe, so they run away, and they look for help. They have no name. They call the lady, the exploiter, they call her madame and master. They have no name for the person. They don't have the name for the recruitment agency. They have no contract. They have nothing. So how can we get into a police or any kind of procedure with this? We can do nothing about it. So we try to go to asylum seeking. So is that the real solution, or the solution would be to just decide? If we consider a person to be a victim, think about the protection of the victim and not about how to get her in a judicial, for us sometimes it can go to 10 or 13 years of procedures. And the last point is to also ask, since we are in the European Commission, and I have the opportunity to say that there is the AMIF funds, that 75% of these fundings, European fundings on migration, are going through the states. So maybe the European Commission at one point can ask the states to make sure that combating human trafficking is part of the national funding that they can have, or at least that they can use part of it to support such work, because usually this is only for, at least in France, only for regular migrants. So if we are an irregular migrant, we have no possibility of being under a project with the EU Commission through the national money.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for reminding us on the money. On the money, this is what most activists don't really know, you know. There is country money, you know, and money coming from the European Commission, and it should be spent, you know, but nobody really knows, you know, so where is it, you know? There are some NGOs sometimes, you know, revealing this issue, but there's certainly, we should probably certainly put pressure on the governments to spend the money where it's really needed in the fight against human trafficking and also in connection with migration. So thank you very much. To the floor. Who wants to? István, please.
So I would like just to respond one point. What Vice Secretary Sylvia Hahn mentioned, the responsibility of the European higher education system because of the missing memories regarding the migration history in Europe. So later on, maybe it will be already in the night when I will speak about the health impact. Unfortunately, even on the most everyday problem, on migration-related health aspect. It is also not on the agenda, on the higher education system in Europe. So maybe that is also a forum where we may raise the responsibility of the higher education system on that. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Others? We have to speed up a little bit, sorry, because I don't want the last ones not to be heard. Okay, so that's it. I thank you very much. I thank the panel, and I would immediately, thank you very much. War wirklich sehr gut, ja. And I would immediately invite to the next panel. By the way, we had foreseen, we would foresee a short break, but we will skip that, you know. You just walk out, take something to eat or to drink and come in, please. So we would just continue. We have the next panel is, our next panel is on children. Again, let me remind you, the same issue, but looking specifically at children. We called the panel, Where Have All the Children Gone? And when will we ever learn? So please, I would like to ask Helmut Sachs to come to the podium. I would like to ask Daya Vanka and Olivier Peyrou. Those who follow us and those who discuss with us know these experts already. Olivier, he's here, yeah. Okay, so I would like then to ask Helmut Sachs to give some introductory remarks. He is from the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute. He's a researcher, expert. He's part of the monitoring mechanism of Council of Europe, Greta, and many more. And he's the one whom we address if we wish to, when we want to know something more or something, yeah, in Austria, something about children and how to avoid exploitation of children. And he said in his sentence, we need to listen to the voice of trafficked children. So if you are ready, then you have the floor. Meanwhile, I can also introduce to you Daya Vanka. Daya Vanka, she's an independent researcher and consultant in child rights. She has worked many years. Actually, I'm proud. She started working with me many years ago, at the Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe. But then she has developed in a child rights expert and worked with UNICEF, with Innocenti Research Center. She is staying in Italy, and now again here, not for the first time, so we appreciate very much. And we have Olivier Peyrou. He's a sociologist from France, and he has become suddenly famous, let's say, well known and researched because of his book. He published a book on the situation of children in Europe. So you have the floor, Helmut.
Finally, the technical issues seem to work. First of all, thank you to the audience for still being patient enough to listen also to our panel. Thank you, Helga, for the invitation and the kind introduction already. Where have all the children gone, and when will we ever learn? It sounds almost like a song from the 60s, but it's not that romantic. Actually, my basic issue I want to discuss at this really short introductory remarks is just what about the voices of children in all these trafficking discourses? We speak of victims, but to what extent are actually the victims themselves are heard, especially when it comes to the youngest of them, children, by definition, at least according to the child rights concept, all human beings below the age of 18, so just to be clear on that aspect. And this title with the "Where have all the children gone?" It's already an indication that we try to link all our discussions today with the migration context and crisis situations, trafficking risks in this context. There is a very specific issue which has been quite hotly debated, at least last year, on the so-called disappearance of children from institutions, with all difficulties in it. For example, the lack of data. I just mentioned a few countries like Norway, Sweden. We have figures. For Austria, for example, it's not really clear how many children actually disappeared. And on the other hand, the question I want to raise is, as I said before, what can we learn from the concept of child participation in order to make the voices of children heard? But before going into this topic, and actually sorry for my voice, but I somehow caught some cold, I also wanted to state that inequality comes with exploitation, and this is happening in all countries of the world. We should have no ideas or thinking that exploitation is something related to specific parts of the world. And actually the same can be said for trafficking to a large extent, but still at the same time I would like to make a distinction between the two. Because trafficking is a defined concept. Let's say whether it's a clearly defined concept, but that's something we already touched upon today. But at the same time also exploitation is a specific form of a specific phenomenon. I call it a kind of an abuse of power for own profit, which in my view is distinct, for example, from violence. But at the same time, we, in all the countries, and that's also actually one of the experiences from Greta, from the Council of Europe perspective, we have completely diverse understanding what is exploitation of people actually. And this also somehow has an impact on what is actually trafficking and how to deal with it. Then we have migration situations, adding to vulnerabilities of children. And then we have the status of children. And because it was mentioned before already, from my perspective, it's not just poverty, for example, which is a root cause of exploitation or of trafficking. In my view, it actually starts with the status of children, with kind of social contracts, how children are perceived by society, what are the roles, they have to fulfill. To what extent are they considered by the family members as a resource or as a burden? There's a gender dimension then to it. Of course, children, also in terms of age, is a very inhomogeneous group. And also how children actually cope with trauma situations, for example, during migration, is very different from adults. So all of this increases risks of exploitation on the one hand. At the same time, at least like we have seen in Europe, 2015, if there's also a kind of a collapse of the structures, this combines into a particular situation of vulnerability for them. And then I added just as a kind of worst case, even if then children in such a situation are forced to commit offenses, then usually there's a complete breakdown of any kind of identification of children as being victims, because they are just seen as perpetrators. They have been stealing something, and then they should be punished, which goes contrary to one of the most fundamental concepts in trafficking, this concept of non-punishment for offenses for which you have been forced to commit, compelled to commit. And just also what I wanted to mention at this stage is this kind of vulnerabilities are not just happening, but they are also created, deliberately created, in order to exploit the difficulties of young children. So in terms of the responses then, it's quite nice to speak of child protection systems. We have all kinds of standards, international child rights standards, we have regional standards, we have EU standards. Speaking of integrated child protection systems to offer a protective environment of children. But the question is, to what extent are they actually safe enough, dense enough to deal with these complex realities of children? And at the same time, I think this will be discussed at the panel quite soon, to what extent are these approaches integrated into general child protection efforts? That's not that self-evident. We can see it from our greater reports. If you have had a look at them, child trafficking as such, assistance, identification has been identified by our group as the biggest single challenge for implementing the Anti-Trafficking Convention. We realized that this blurring of concepts contributed to difficulties, these isolated approaches, the lack of identification, the difficulties in having qualified guardians, for example, access to justice, and even reliance on detention for their own benefit, so to say, in some countries. Here I like this written contribution we received from Smile of the Child from Greece, where they actually stated children do not need a guard, but someone to take care of them. Trust-building efforts. On the other hand, at least we have seen some examples of positive engagement with the phenomenon, to have multidisciplinary identification, to have outreach activities. In some countries like Netherlands, you have well-established guardianship systems, cultural mediators, etc. So now about child participation, I can say this is actually already the second last slide. We have all kinds of standards, and for me, child participation is always linked with best interests. Best interests of the child is the kind of fundamental guiding principle for the whole area of human rights of children, that there should be priority consideration given to children. And how do you identify the best interests? Well, the most obvious question should be ask them in an appropriate way, of course. We have international guidance on this. We have also practical guidance. We have like this best interest determination handbook from UNHCR. We have soft law standards from the Council of Europe on child-friendly justice. In that context, I was always wondering, why is there only a discussion about child-friendly justice in court settings? Why not in administrative procedures? We think about child-friendly settings at court, victim protection, witness protection at court, information access, interpretation services, etc. But if you look into asylum procedures, administrative procedures, for example, or also identification of trafficking victims. What about child-friendly settings there? It's a complete absence, actually. And then we have some other practical guidelines on, for example, also this issue of prevention of missing, of children going missing, like from Missing Children in Europe, published last year. Or also in the Council of Baltic Sea States, they also developed guidelines on how to protect children through cross-border cooperation, actually. So my main point is, what can now actually be the role of children in all these efforts? I just outlined a few, not just on the prevention side, but for example, proactive identification outreach. From greater perspective, we have seen it, for example, in Spain. NGOs work together with former victims of child trafficking in order to have access to communities. So they do that kind of street work. Of course, they are well prepared, trained, and then they go to certain places, hotspot areas where it is known that in Spain it's basically about sexual exploitation. So they try to engage with other young people and offer them assistance services, refer them to their own organization, etc. Because why should someone like me or someone from university go and do street work, for example, in order to identify possible victims, risk groups? Why not ask those who have gone through all these experiences and have found ways to get out of it and survive these situations? Why not ask them to actually do it from a much better perspective, of course. Another issue where children's voices would be essential is for the reporting, also as an additional tool for identification, having hotlines targeting specifically children. There has been another example from our colleagues from Greece here. Or to have feedback mechanisms in institutions. We often hear about the important role, of course, of service providers, but to what extent are there possibilities for children staying in those institutions to actually give feedback to the service providers on their experiences, how they actually feel, if there are difficulties within the group. I think that's also an important aspect. Or access to complaint mechanisms, even in many countries, actually, at least in Europe, we already have specialized ombudsman structures for children, which could also be an interesting avenue to become aware of situations of exploitation. Then we have the research field, also my own area of expertise. It is possible to work with children, even under these very difficult backgrounds and under very difficult situations. Basically, the colleagues from the panel have all worked in such context, and it has proven to be relevant to get new insights, not to speak about children, but with children, basically. And finally, also for the monitoring then. What is the role of children in monitoring efforts? Like from a greater perspective, for example, to some extent we actually do not do it systematically because we rely on NGOs. In all the country visits next week, I will go to Ukraine, for example. We will have visits to a shelter where trafficking victims are placed. And sometimes, at least we try also to have access to child victims, but we do not enforce this. It really depends on the country situation and on the NGOs to what extent they see this useful or not. But at least it's always an opportunity, at least, for bringing that kind of feedback also to us as a monitoring body. And the same should work on the national context as well. Just 2 weeks ago, I attended a project where we tried to work with the Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva to identify good practices for child involvement in monitoring. Not just taking children to Geneva to have a very exciting day there with the International Committee, but really to start with them in identifying issues. What are the most relevant issues in your country, and what should be interesting solutions from your own perspective. So all of this, I think, should also come into the mind. For example, when we get, as Greta, shadow reports from civil society. So that's really the last slide actually. The basic idea of bringing children into the discourse directly, giving them a stronger voice would be to have improved relevance and effectiveness of responses. If we think of all that kind of prevention activities, for example, video clips, usually conceived by adults, why not ask the children themselves, how would you deal with that issue? How would you raise awareness of your peer group on that kind of issue? And also then to have improved sustainability of measures. And at the same time, it's also a way of self-reflection for us to think about actually what is the purpose of our work here we are doing, what is our actual target group, to reconnect with the target group, which in that context would be children. Apart from a fundamental statement, it's the right of children to be heard and taken seriously and to end the visibility and ignorance of them. Thank you.
We come to we would like the two panelists to comment on it, both well known, you know, it's an issue. I don't know, Daya, would you like to say a few words with regard to what Helmut said?
Thank you, Helga. Helmut has already said it all, and I knew he would, so I'm being very bold now, and I would like to try take 1 minute of my 5 to launch a bold pledge to the ministry, although I know they are no longer present, in the hope that they will really continue to support your initiative, because I think these events that you organize are so important and so unique also, and of high quality, and I really hope we'll have the continuous opportunities to meet also in the next years. So thank you very much for that. I think I'll pick up a few issues from what Helmut said and elaborate a bit on that, and hope I won't be repetitive. I think despite all our criticism, we still have achieved a lot in Europe to safeguard children in the context of migration and in the context of asylum. And as we said so many times before today, many of these provisions are, however, not implemented effectively. And this weak or missing implementation is in fact creating new risks and vulnerabilities for children, because the risks and the structural risk factors that we have in our migration and asylum systems do increase vulnerabilities, especially when the resilience of children and families is very low. And with becoming more vulnerable, also the risks of exploitation or violence, including in the context of trafficking, increases. I'd like to mention a few examples where weak or missing or wrongful implementation increases the risks of children and puts them at a specific risk of being exploited or trafficked. And there are in fact a few points in the asylum reception systems. I'd like to focus on asylum maybe to make it easier, that are almost like gatekeepers. But I think we are too little aware of these gatekeepers that decide on whether children are included in the asylum reception system or excluded. And the first issue I'd like to mention is age assessment procedures. It can be fundamental for a child who doesn't have paper and for adolescents where the authorities don't know exactly how old this person is, to undergo an age assessment in order to be recognized as a child and therefore get access to the services they are entitled to. And from a point of view of international standards and child rights perspective, we would argue, and we do argue at the international level, that age assessment procedures should be initiated in the best interest of the child. And that could be the case, for instance, where there are serious doubts about the age of a child, because we can argue it is in the best interest of a child to be officially recognized as a child. It can also be important when a child simply doesn't have proof of age or doesn't know exactly how old he or she is. And we do have many children that have never been registered at birth in different countries all over the world. But in practice, we see that age assessment procedures are not implemented like that. Many countries in Europe do conduct age assessment procedures with the interest to prove that the person is an adult. So this is the first moment in the reception where children are excluded. And there are cases that have been documented where children who have been wrongfully assessed as adults, placed in adult accommodation, received very little support, were later on exposed to different forms of violence and exploitation, including cases of sexual exploitation that may also qualify with the definition of trafficking. The second of these sort of gatekeepers is the guardianship. Every unaccompanied or separate child has a right to have a guardian appointed, and this is recognized in European law, in our national laws. But in fact, we find many, many challenges in the way that this right and entitlement is implemented in practice. In many cases, the appointment of a guardian is getting delayed, and this can be crucial for 16 or 17 years old. And even after the appointment of a guardian, the first contact between the guardian and the child can be delayed even more. So sometimes it can take a year before an adolescent gets to see the guardian for the first time. And maybe by that point of time, a 17-year-old is already 18, or a 16-year-old is facing and approaching the 18th birthday. Now, the guardian is important not only to complement the limited legal capacity of children and to promote their best interest, but also for many administrative purposes. For instance, in many countries, the presence of a guardian is a precondition for the child to launch, to hand in an asylum application. So unless there is effective contact with a competent guardian, children have no means of applying for asylum and are again then often aging out of their opportunities to seek asylum as children and to have their child-specific asylum grounds assessed. A third issue that has also been mentioned today is that we do have residence permits for victims of trafficking, including children, but they are often no longer applied. I think Susanne has mentioned that, and Mona also. Countries often take the perspective that if they receive asylum seekers who are under 18 years of age, to give them time-limited residence permits until they turn 18. And they think that is an appropriate approach to children, but it is not, because from an international child rights perspective, we would argue that every child has a right to have a best interest determination. And with that best interest determination, the child, the state or the assessing authorities should decide if it is in the best interest of the child to stay or to return, and take, of course, vulnerability factors into account, or also experiences of violence and exploitation, including in the context of trafficking. And finally, the identification of victims of trafficking, child victims of trafficking, often simply does not work. As Helmut also mentioned, many of the challenges in the identification procedure. We know that many officials and professionals and practitioners do identify hints or signals or signs of exploitation, possible signs of trafficking, but there's no effective follow-up. And the threshold to granting the victim status is often quite high, whereas we know from case stories and research with children that identification of trafficking is so complex that it often is a lengthy process. And the official identification of a victim of trafficking often comes after service provision, whereas in many European countries, the official identification is a precondition to granting access to services. So what I'm trying to say is that there are many, many challenges that prevent children from enjoying the rights they actually have under international, European, and national law. So we do have all these layers of safeguards, the UN standards and conventions, European law, not only from European Union, but also from the Council of Europe, the national law, but all of that fails because some matters simply exclude children. And we also know that for identification and for granting support to child victims of trafficking, trust is maybe the most important component in order to make them feel okay, feel respected, to feel they can really talk freely about what has happened to them without fearing any negative consequences of what they are telling, and also in order for them to trust that they can disclose experiences of violence, exploitation, or even trafficking. But the system is made in a way and functions in a way that this trust is consistently undermined. And I would say that is mainly maybe the most important challenge, and where we really are talking also about the quality of human relations and the way we meet children, not as objects that need to be rescued, but as persons, as personalities, as rights holders, and persons who have a right to be treated with respect for their dignity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is more on the issue also in our background paper, also from Daya. I should simply mention that a representative of the organization, the NGO, the Smile of the Child, cannot be here or wanted to be here, and he has provided a written contribution. This is also available at our website. And but just one question before I ask Olivier. He said something. I looked at it, and he said something. A guardianship or guardian is not so important. You know, it's more important to have people who genuinely care about children. Could you just quickly, all three, really comment on that, but really very short, you know, just to be clear also for others, yeah?
Yeah, I think that is maybe a misunderstanding. I read it yesterday night, and the ambassador is speaking about guards in places where children are staying. That could be even detention centers. And the point he's making, I think, is really about receiving children with respect for their individual story and their individual human rights. And so I think that was a very valuable contribution.
Good, yeah, thank you very much. So you find this text also at our website. And now Olivier Peyrou, well known for his research he did on the Balkans, but on children or on children in Europe in general. Last year he was here also telling us what was going on at the so-called jungle, you know, in Calais. And this time, if it's still true, you told me you would focus on Libya and the link to Europe and maybe unaccompanied children or whatever. His sentence he provided was, and it's a question, have the recent migration flows that worry a large number of European citizens and states led to a normalization of the phenomenon of human trafficking considered as the price to pay for the refugees and migrants? So it links up again to the question we asked at the beginning. Please, your comments.
Yeah, okay. So first, yeah, thank you very much for your invitation and this very, very important initiative. I reframe a little bit my presentation because it was a lot of information that you said before, and so I will be on the point because I know that people are staying here from many hours now. So just some few inputs about children, because we can hear, you know, in other conferences that children are very vulnerable and they have to be protected and so on. But if we are looking about the political will about to protect children victims of trafficking, before this migrant flow, I think it was not a very real will to protect those children. We just need to have a look to the Greta report, and we see that in the most of the Western European countries, we can see that the official number of identified children victims of trafficking is less than 20 at the national level. So you know, it's not a big number. It means that, and we are not sure that they are protected. You know, excepting perhaps UK, Italy, and more or less Germany, but This is the first point. When we are focusing on unaccompanied minors, in the jungle, the number is close to 0 for minors who are identified as victims of trafficking. So it depends for sure on the country, but it's a very, very low number. So we can't say in the fact that there are a real policy to fight against this trafficking, this kind of trafficking. And most of the states, they just focus on to fight against smuggling. And there is here a kind of confusion because it's most of the time they present the fight against smugglers as a fight against trafficking, But if we, for instance, in Calais, I will take a concrete example. In Calais, in 2015, it was 23 network of smugglers were stopped by the police. In 2016, it was 33 networks, and it was no investigation on trafficking issue. And we can see that between 2015 and 2016, the price to reach UK from Calais, it's more or less you need to pay the double price. So even if you fight against smugglers, you don't fight against the process of trafficking and those consequences. If they pay a big price, a big amount of money, they need after to work to pay back their debt and so on. So here it's a little bit tricky. And sometimes also some minors are recruited by those networks to control or to guide the migrant from one point to another. So when we are looking who were arrested, in this network, sometimes it was some children who were victims of trafficking, forced for criminality, So here we have to be careful. Also, the idea of network in trafficking. Most of the time, we think that it's like international network. As Mona said before, sometimes there is no network, and sometimes, as you said, the family could be involved, and that's all. So there is not, the special unit to fight against trafficking. They are not very interested to investigate this kind of cases because it's not an international, a network, criminal network. So here it's also a problem. And also where I'm a little bit surprised, it's most of the time the targeted group are very clear. For instance, if you see the arrival in Italy from Libya, for instance, you know that like 30% of Nigerian women or Somali women are in the flow of unaccompanied minors. And when you go and you see in the shelter how many there are, it's like 3 or 4%. So it means that a big part of them, they disappear. If you go in Greece, you can see, everywhere some children from Pakistan, from Algeria, from Morocco who are selling drugs, and they are not, in shelter. So we have an idea, a clear idea of which group we can target to fight against trafficking. And most of the time, there is no concrete policy for that. And just to conclude, and this is my point, it's what I observe about this issue, and it's child protection becomes to be a kind of private business in many states for unaccompanied minors. Most of the time there is discrimination between national children, and unaccompanied minors or children from abroad. It was the case with the so-called Roma children, that most of the time they are not protected they are not in the child protection system because it's too complicated or I don't know what. And it's more or less the same with unaccompanied minors, but states are giving money to some organizations, sometimes NGOs, or I don't know how we can call them. They try to make a kind of benefit with this money and to provide some very cheaper services, because you know, states or municipalities, they say we can't spend so much money for those children, so we need to have a very lower price. For instance, in France, it's around 150 euros for 1 day for a French child to stay in a shelter in France. For unaccompanied minors, now the price it's like 70 euros, so now it's half price, you know. And if we go in Sweden, for instance, even if for in Sweden, most of the time the state give to the private sectors, you know, the initiative for sheltering, for protect those children. And here I think this is a big concern, because if we accept that child protection become a part of the private sector and a benefit sectors, so it's not possible to deal and to say, okay, you have to go in the field, you have to have mobile time, mobile team, you need to have like a smile, they say in the text, you need to have psychological assistance and something like that. And this is my concern. It's we assist to a very, very low standard of child protection, and the consequences is to grow the number of children who are victims of trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Comments? Comments, questions, contributions? Sorry, you are like it's always the same with our round table, you know. We think it's so important issues, and then we realize that, you know, later in the afternoon it's yeah, it's heavy all day, listening all day. But it was excellent, thank you very much. What we shall do anyway, with all our experts, we shall ask them to provide their few slides they had, or let's say the text or so, and you will get it. And we shall also ask, because I see we won't have time for the you know, let's say ways forward or the discussion on this, we will ask our experts to provide, you know, 1, 2, 3 ideas, you know, on what they think should be changed, you know, not the whole lot of it, but from their perspective. And you will get it so that you have an idea of what it could be. And next time we will take it on again and discuss it further. Okay, so thank you very much for this panel. And we have one more panel. Thank you. We have one more panel, and this panel is on, because we said health issues, you know. The health issues are important, and the implications on human trafficking, so please come here, take the floor. We have Istvan Szilágy, he's the chief scientific advisor of the University of Pécs Medical School, and Department of Operational Medicine from Hungary. He said, I mean, he's really, I mean, he's very often with us, you know, but this time he's also deputizing for the WHO. We had in mind, or we cooperate also with the WHO on these issues, but then Santino was prevented, and he accepted, Istvan accepted the invitation, and he said, health assistance of migrants, especially victims of trafficking, needs well-trained health professionals. Unfortunately, in the EU, there is a shortage of under and or postgraduate training in this field. So this is his approach to it, and please, you take the floor. Be short, be precise, please, so that we have a bit of time for discussion. Thank you very much.
May I ask for the slides, please? No, it is not mine.
No, it's their one, the children one.
Yeah. It was.
From Mr. Sack.
No, it is not mine. Sorry.
So please tell me which one it is.
That was this one.
This one.
Yes.
This one.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank Helga for that honorable. No, I am not skipping because it's really a very important issue that repeatedly during your roundtable discussions, the health aspect are represented, and unfortunately, it is not a general attitude for most of the similar fora. Helga has warned me repeatedly to use only simple and not too many slides, and I try to follow her advice, because if I would like to go in depth regarding the health aspect, what victims of trafficking are suffering with, then it would be just the textbook of gynecology as well as the textbook of psychiatry. But something regarding my background and expertise. Helga has mentioned already WHO is engaged in that. Our institute is WHO Collaborating Center, and previously I was acting as IOM health focal point for Europe in assisting victims of trafficking. It started already during the war in former Yugoslavia, when in Sarajevo and then in Kosovo, that was just the crossroad of traffickers, and IOM was establishing there the first shelter. I was in charge to setting up the health assistance of the victims, and there was a shortage of physicians. I personally was engaged in assisting them. And that is why I have really not only a theoretical but a practical knowledge what seriously they are exploited to all type, physical, sexual, mental. And from that point of view, the assistance of them needs not only a good knowledge in gynecology, or even not in psychiatry or psychology, but all those who are engaged in the assistance have to be aware about their background, what are those serious issues, exploitation they have went through, they have expected, they were exposed to, and as a consequence, many of them lost the trust in anybody, even not in the physicians. So that's why the first issue, even for the medical assistants, to learn how to approach them, how to gain their cooperation, how to gain their trust, because for any health and medical assistance, the partnership is the baseline, and if the physician could be the best in his practice, is not specially trained to gain the cooperation, the trust of the victims, it will be a lost case. Just highlight some issues. You can see what are mostly the background of victims of trafficking from the beginning, not only when they are already victims, they are suffering with some health aspect. That is what I have previously mentioned, all type of violence and exploitation, what they are exposed to. Again, I do not want to go into medical issues. Please believe me. The gynecological textbook is one by one what one may even recognize. That is it. But what is an important additional issue? That not only the direct health impact, the impaired health is the only issue, but their history is leading them easily to be involved in other harms, drug, alcohol, and in general, they cannot from themselves being integrated into the society. If you are sitting down with them, they will explain, okay, now from health point of view, I am recovered, but please tell me, how can I go home? What, not only my family, but everybody in the community, how they will look at me. So that's why an additional, and it has not only social, but health aspect as well, psychological support as well, the reintegration. And it is, how can I say, not an adverse, but there are very good books on it. Those who have interest can go. It is for a layperson, not only for expert. But what I would like really highlight, that not only the victims, but also the helpers are also in need of assistance. Helping the helpers, in the meaning that those who are listening day by day, all those holistic stories. So just like, even they are not psychotherapists, but just like a psychotherapist, they need the backup support. And the other issue, so they should not work alone, in the meaning that border police, police in general, other regular system of the society should be sensitized towards. Even not only to recognize, but what at the very beginning I have mentioned, be in the knowledge and skill to gain the trust and the cooperation. There are some initiatives for the police, but not really working. What, and now it is really the case was advert. There are 6 European universities who were working together to compose a specialist on migration health accredited training. It will be launched February by the University of Pécs. It is a full-time 4-semester postgraduate thing, and trafficking and health aspect of trafficking is very much represented in that training. So when previously it was mentioned the responsibility of the higher education system, and I mentioned I unfortunately have to fully agree with this, over in Europe, some NGOs on their own are setting up trainings for assistance. But if you are looking at the academic level, unfortunately, practically, there is nothing. Thank you.
Thank you for this most interesting aspects of it. May I just mention there is a newsletter?
Yes.
I don't know, maybe we could, or at least we put it at our website or send it to interested participants here, you know, because there's a newsletter on migrant health, or what is it? You might probably better tell us what it is. It can be, it's on, just use it. No, it's on, just use it, yeah.
Yes, WHO has launched a newsletter that is the public health aspect of migration in Europe. We are providing the editorial offices, and I will give the last not only the last issue, but also the access, because through the WHO web page, it could be freely downloaded. Even you can ask to get it regularly via email.
Mm-hmm. That's it. So those who are more interested, you know, in the public health aspects, this was more or less we also would like next time, you know, maybe we can discuss it also with WHO more. What lessons do we learn, you know, from
not speaking about that. Helga, you are a member of the editorial board.
Yeah, I'm a member of that too, this is true, but I would like to share it with others so that we can discuss next time more intensively on this, and maybe not as last panel. Yeah. So welcome to others at the panel. We have on one hand Nora Martin-Janko. She's social worker at Lotus Bus program. She's part of Médecins du Monde. And she said the fight against human trafficking, starts with listening to and empowering victims rather than criminalizing them. And she's very right by this. And we have Barbara Breitler, psychologist and psychotherapist in Austria. She has written many books. I can really you find the publications also on our webpage, link to the round table. I can really, those who are interested, please read it. It's most interesting. And she said, forced to give up control and autonomy about its own life means a traumatic loss of human dignity and has traumatic consequences. And this is what we know also from victims. They say the most the most terrible experience is this loss of control, you know, that you can't control what you do, nor what you get, what you eat, and more. So these, I would like to ask both to comment a bit on that, and also to give us some insight on what you do. So maybe I start with Nora. She is very active and works, I mean, she has studied Chinese. She speaks I don't know how, but probably fluently Chinese, and is working currently with Chinese sex workers. And at first sight, I think you told me that they do it, you know, they are not obviously forced in doing what they do, but nevertheless, it's also a health issue. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it within the framework of Médecins du Monde. Just tell us a little bit about it, please, and then maybe we have also questions from the floor. Please, you have.
Okay, hello everyone. Well, it's a bit hard to come at last because I have the impression that everything what I wanted to say has already been said. But what you just said about the lack of training in medical staff reminded me of a story. I was accompanying a victim of rape who was actually also a sex worker, but you can be a sex worker and victim of rape at the same time. To the hospital to get a medical health care and a medical certificate to file a complaint. And I remember a doctor saying, but, you know, I mean, she must be used to it, no? It's a prostitute cannot really be raped, right? And I remember looking at him and saying, do you actually want me to translate this, or what should I do? And he was like, oh, no, yeah, well, no, don't translate it, please. But it's things you hear all the time, especially when you do the translation and you are like a mediator between the health, medical staff, the police, the judges, everywhere, because they don't really, I mean, I work with with women who almost don't speak French, so they usually don't feel like they will speak with them directly, so they kind of say things that they would maybe not dare to say directly to the concerned persons. But actually, maybe I should talk a little bit. In France, we have this system. I mean, I didn't know that. I don't know if it exists in other countries, but we have this system called aide médicale d'État. It's medical state aid, and that enables undocumented migrants to have a social health care, and it's for free, and they can go to the hospital. And so this is kind of a good thing, because usually, if they're victims of trafficking or exploitation, the first person they will go to is actually a doctor. I mean, you usually come to, if you ask the question, you will come across this question about like through health issues. I mean, it's not the only way, but most of the time you go for a health situation, and then you will, if you ask a question, you will be able to know a bit more about the person. But having this, if there's no real training of the staff, it's kind of useless, in my opinion, because then we just come across this sort of situations, like people just having a representation about what a victim of trafficking is, what sex worker is, and then they will just not really listen to what the person is actually saying, but just like think the way they would feel themselves, and just, I don't know how you say it, but just put their representation on this person. So that's one other thing I wanted to say. Like today, I had the feeling we talk a lot about victims and victims, and they are victims, but I wanted to say also that, in my opinion, they are not only victims. They're also human beings full of resources, and it's really important to make them be a part of all this. I mean, no offenses, but it would have been great to have like someone who is actually concerned by this question around this table. I know it's not that easy, but like the top-down thing is really important, but the bottom-up is also really important. I think we should have both ways of working towards this issue, human trafficking, because listening to what people who are concerned by these issues have to say, I mean, the same that Helmut Sachs talked about the children. I mean, we have the same approach. We try to be in a community, what we call community approach. We have sex workers or former sex workers on our team as employed in our organization, but also on our outreach. We really try to make them participate to the decisions. Some women, and they're really brave, created an association called the Steel Roses, and they are Chinese sex workers. They're all undocumented, and they don't really speak French, but they had the guts really to create their own associations, and they could go to the parliament, and when there was this change of law, they could speak on their own behalf and meet with deputies. And I think this is really important, that they are listened to, and it's not just always us that speak in their name.
Yeah, for them, yeah, that's good, yeah. Excellent, yeah, thank you very much. Maybe you could just say a few words on this Lotus bus program.
Yeah, so it's harm reduction program. So we are like working on prevention, sexual and reproductive health, prevention issues, prevention of HIV, STIs, but also on defending sex workers' rights. And we also have integrated now a program who is like combating violence that sex workers are actually experiencing, not only, I mean, sexual violence, exploitation violence, but also institutional violence, because this is really an important point, actually. That's why I was
also
saying,
due to legislation, really.
yes,
you know,
I mean, and other kind of things. It's, for example, in 2013 we had the case where a mafia of exploitation was, I mean, the police arrested and investigated some apartments where there was sex work, and there were 20 Chinese sex workers that were arrested. 2 of them they convicted, and the 18 others were put in jail for undocumented reasons, so for having no papers. So I mean, how is this actually protect him? victims. I mean, they all go around with, oh, they're victims, and we have to protect them. But in the end, they will also always find a way, because that's what we were talking about today. We just fight migration through irregular, documented. I mean, how can I say? They will always find another way around. So if it's not for procuring, it will be for undocumented reasons. And in the end, they're always the ones that are criminalized.
Yeah.
Although they are the ones that need the more help. So if I would say, I mean, the roundtable, how health issues and combating human trafficking, I would say the way actually in France human trafficking is combated is actually has an impact on the health, on the physical, on the security, physical and mental health of victims of trafficking. And at least I can speak for the women I work with. So.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. And now I would like to ask Barbara Breitler to say something about trauma, about the health problems of victims of trafficking, what it makes with them. It's not just, you cure something and then it's done. So please, you have a very comprehensive view on this.
Thank you very much. It's now my part to be the very last one here. Even if I like what Nora just said, I think it's just the same thing from another side. First of all, in the morning we heard 12 seconds to decide if the asylum request, the migration request is right or not. Wow. In psychotherapy, we need several years to understand the story of trauma. Not only we, as the therapists, even in being the mirror of my client, even the clients themselves. I have no idea how you do it in 12 seconds, and I have my doubts that this will work. I think even it will go the other direction. If I'm not traumatized, it might be much, much easier to learn that I have to prove in a few seconds what I have to tell. We know that trauma means a very difficult tension between two poles. On one side, the memory, on the other side, the memory is so painful that I do a lot, conscious, unconscious, to avoid this memory. How I can tell in a few seconds about this? How I can tell, even if I have more time, about this? A very difficult task. It's even in asylum process a very, very difficult task. I have no solution for it. Of course, we need to prove, is it right that this asylum request is made, this request for migration is right. But to go deep to the inner wounds is very, very difficult. I have no solution for this, but I think we should be very much aware about it, what it means to the people. One thing I also have learned in more than 20 years of psychotherapy is if a client gives me in the first session a story of trauma, it's never the worst. I have the feeling it's more, they give me the story that even I as a therapist keep silent, ask for further. There is always something more hidden behind. Trauma means that the memory becomes fragments. It's never one story in. And if we speak about human trafficking, about forced migration, we have a lot of traumatic single events coming together as the whole story. So it takes a procedure to learn what is the background of the person. One story came immediately to my mind when I was invited from Helga to speak here is about a man. His story, very brief. He was tortured, his father was killed, his brother was killed. It was totally clear he is the next on the list. He was sent from his relatives out of the country to a northern European place. He reached Austria. He did not want to stay here, so illegal he was brought to this northern European country. He wanted to stay there. He was illegal there. To be illegal means to be so vulnerable. A family said they will help him to survive, but it means they made him to the slave of this family. Because always the pressure, you are illegal, you have to stay with us, you are doing homework in our place, but we protect you. But definitely he was a slave of this family with this pressure behind. Finally, they got him. He was in the detention camp. He was deported to Austria, and he was very sad that he didn't stay before legal here with legal rights. What really touched me so deep in this story was in a long process of therapy, we went through all these different parts of his traumatization, but what was staying most deeply was the part of being made to a slave. I was astonished. Torture, killing, but this he could somehow integrate in his understanding of life. But why these people who said they help him did this form of human rights violation against him is still an open wound till today. This means if I am not allowed to have the control over my own life, when other people tell me what I have to do, it takes away my dignity. It takes from me what makes my identity as an adult person or as a youth person or as a child. It's a very deep-rooted violation of human rights. And one last point I want to add is, a few years ago, I went to studies about the history of Afro-American slavery. And always when it came to the point what was the individual situation of these people, the reference was from Holocaust survivors. I was astonished also about this part. What I think, the Holocaust had a lot of speechless people, but luckily there were among the survivors people who were very well educated and were able to speak and to write about their experience. So they gave a voice to the whole community who was affected. It seems out of these people who were made to slaves, there was not enough education, that nobody was writing something in this way. And I'm not so sure how it is with this group, if we call them slaves or if we call them human trafficked people, if they have this voice, what you just mentioned before. I think it's so important to give them the chance for empowerment and to raise their own voices. I think even in our work, if we do psychotherapeutic treatment for these people, the most important thing is that they can survive in a way that they take back control over their own lives and they are able to speak for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Comments? Questions, please. That we have a micro. You just just introduce yourself because you have
Yes, hi, my name is Joanna Vravets, and I'm involved in issues related to trafficking for many years. And lately I have been working for IOM Libya, organizing trainings for migrant detention centers for police officers and for coast guards. So, and actually what you were just saying relate too much to my latest experiences in this field, and especially all the three actually. And so I just have two brief comments, because one of the things that Dr. Ishvand was mentioning about the health problems, and also once you're also involved in the migration health, and just to share that the situation in the migrant detention camps in Libya is horrendous, and everything is happening there. And this affects not only the migrant population, but also the helpers that are working there. So, and they have different ways of coping with this, and then they are also exposed to all kinds of infectious disease, from scabies, tuberculosis, everything, and also to several corpses in decomposition, because as hospitals don't take them, they don't have body bags, they don't have refrigerating chambers, so they just leave, the dead between the alive ones. So the situation is bad. Then another point that was just mentioned by Nora, and it was very interesting in what comes to this perception of the prostitute cannot be raped. And also just to share that during the human rights training I was doing with these people, with investigators, I was used to stories. One of them on a woman that worked in a restaurant, and then a situation of sexual exploitation, and then basically the same story, but with a prostitute. And then in the end, all the elements were there, and then I was asking, the group, so what do you think this is? Do you think this woman is a victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation? I said, no. I said, why not? Because Allah doesn't allow prostitution, and therefore
it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. So it took took a while to say, so it means that you will never rescue a woman, because if you assume that they are just doing this voluntarily, they will be there forever, because you will never see a prostitute as a victim of sexual exploitation. And this is the reality. So I hope that after some trainings this starts changing, but reality is this: in several countries where prostitution is illegal, and the vision about the life of a prostitute and the option to become a prostitute, independently of this has been her option or not, they don't care about the conditions that led into this decision, they would never approach or even consider she's a victim of sexual exploitation. Mm-hmm. So, and then to finalize with also the mental health, not only from the victims, but also the people working there, because they are working in such terrible conditions in these migrant detention centers, and all the reactions of the workers will also have huge influence on the health of the victims, and it's totally ignorance about them, because most of these people, they were former militias with guns that were just integrated in the Ministry of Interior. So I will not take longer, but just to share, because this actually is very much related. And congratulations, Helga, you always do the best conferences, and health is such an important aspect.
Thanks to you.
So thank you very much.
If you were not there, so thank you very much. But thank you very much. But let me say a word on, just a quick word on trauma. I mean, to understand trauma is important. It's also important for police, for the judges. If they don't understand, so they everything goes wrong. And unfortunately, we are not very much, it's just, we do trauma, but that's it, and I don't know, something not important, and we certainly we will think a little bit what we could do better in this regard to make it understood better. Please, Ishtan.
So many thanks for your comments, because it was highlighting two very important issues from my point of view. One is that section had the title Screening Results. Unfortunately, there are no real screening results, so that in general, among migrants in Europe, it depends on the country what has been done, but especially what WHO IOM highlights repeatedly, with no real consequence, we need a consistent migrant health database. It is not existing. If we are going about some most, how can I say, shadowed part of migrants, victims of trafficking, yes, during the rehabilitation, these are the data what I was showing. But for example, for those on forced labor or children forced to begging, what really their special health impairment is, no data are about. And the other issue, what you have mentioned, and it's again going back to the need for training, being culturally competent. In the meaning, if we are providing assistance to victims with different cultural, religious background, and so on, the caregivers should be culturally competent in providing the assistance. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, we agree. Yeah, others? Daya. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion. The health debate is so important, and I always wonder why it is not stronger in anti-trafficking initiatives. Because in some themes, in some thematic areas, we do have the experience at working with the public health narrative, and public health arguments works much better than working with a human rights-based narrative. To give you an example, Sweden, for instance, was the first country in 1979 to prohibit corporal punishment of children, even before the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was developed. And that law reform came into force on a public health argumentation, because they have seen the costs of violence against children, and they thought it was important for the society to prevent violence. So, and again, I think that's probably also a collateral damage of the interlink between migration and exploitation and trafficking, that the public health costs are often on the countries of origin. Because in our receiving countries, often the health systems are so restricted to non-nationals, and persons are often sent back. So I'm also wondering about that, if there couldn't be maybe a stronger lobby also using the public health narrative in countries of origin, because the costs must be immense, really. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Others? Oh, sorry. Yeah, please.
Maybe I can make a comment on it, because I think here we come together with the asylum situation now, the way how the public opinion has changed from the welcoming culture to criminals, what we heard. Most people are very concerned about the migrants. I think all of us have to do something if we became witness of trauma. And we became witness of trauma when it comes to the point to listen to the stories, to help people who are traumatized. So we need some defense from our side. There I am totally with you. We have to have programs to help the helpers. That we don't go to this point, we just start and then we change our opinion. And now I don't know how the right pronunciation is. Die Mitleidserschöpfung, compassion, fate. Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I pronounce it right. I am very sorry for a person, and then I get tired of it, and then I change. Maybe he's lying. Maybe they are just criminals. Maybe they cost too much for us. Maybe I have to protect myself. So I think what is really very important in this term is that we take care very good of ourselves, of the helpers in this field, of what we are doing, and that we are with the people. So that we test ourselves, special when we start knowing all of them are lying, this kind of type. We have to ask ourselves, what is going on with me now?
Evelyn?
I especially want to stress what you mentioned now at the end, because was one of the phenomena what we are now living, especially in contact with authorities. Due to that, they are working constantly with traumatized people. This is a turn what we have perceived in the last 2 years. No? It is like a double turn. It's a turn with police officers we already had sensitized and we already have established a good cooperation with, that now via the impact of this public opinion, they are criminalized, they're criminals, or they have to go out of the country. They are internalizing it and then talking to the victim. In this sense, you're only lying. And again, it also because there's no support around. And I also want to stress again that I totally agree with it, that trauma has to be focused in the center. And what we also have experienced via now this nearly 20 years work with the women who had been trafficked to Austria, one of the spaces which is a public speech is the criminal procedure. It's a space where the state takes over the responsibility in the sense of blaming others and not them. That doesn't mean that they have to be actively participating, but this perception of I'm hurt, it's taken in consideration and it's serious. So therefore I'm also like coming to the first panel where the judge said, kick the victims out of the procedure. This is the very wrong, this is absolutely re-traumatizing again, not taking them seriously, what they had gone through, understanding what it means, and taking a representative on their side. Obviously, it has to be the lawyer who is arguing it. It doesn't have to be the victim who is arguing it. Now the victim in the sense of a victim in a criminal procedure. But it has to be taken into consideration, and it has to be taken as the main part of the story, what had happened to in the situation. And to Daya, obviously it's not interested in public health, because how should a country of destination having an interest in public health of that ones that they want to get rid of? We have a quite good legislation in Austria here, where part of the state compensation fund therapy is included. But you have to prove that what you're going through is the effect of the crime. If it was like torture in the country of origin, then it's not the effect of the crime which can be treated here. So there you already see the frame not taking over the responsibility and not being interested in, because they want to get rid of the people.
Yeah, and in this migration and refugee context, it gets worse, you know, instead of going better. Yeah, Istvan and Nora?
I would like just to react because public health was mentioned by both of you. Currently, it is IOM, it is the WHO who is taking seriously the health assistance of victims of trafficking. We are not in the House of the European Union. It has an excellent public health institution in Stockholm, the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. Maybe they will listen to.
Okay. And Nora?
Yes, I just wanted to answer about what was just said, because it really appeals to me, because that's one of the things we see on the field. This year we had an audience of...
Maybe I take a glasses. It doesn't work. Maybe take the other one.
So yeah, it works better. So this year we had an audience, a man who had raped over 20 women, aiming particularly at sex workers because they are more vulnerable targets. And we finally, after 4 years, they've made it to court. I mean, at the end, there were only 7 victims left because most of them, went back to the country or just didn't stand the length and the violence of all the procedures. And in the end, he was convicted. So that was like for justice, for protecting France. But the victims, from 7 victims, only 3 of them were recognized as victims, and 2 were recognized as victims of theft. and not victims of rape. Well, I mean, he was raped. He was like, he had a knife. I mean, it was like really obvious that it was not, did not agree to sexual intercourse. And the result is that now, these women, they told me, I mean, we have been standing in this procedure for 4 years. I mean, we were tired. You have to tell your story over and over again. And at the end, France just spit in my face. That's what they said. I mean, you know, it's like they didn't recognize me as being a victim. They just like were suspecting them and saying like, you just do this for getting paper. You just do this for the money. I mean, in the end, well, they didn't get anything and not even being recognized as victims. And they told me, you know, next time if this happened, I'm not gonna go to the police. What for? I mean, they are not protecting me. And they told me, they were also angry at me. I mean, I can understand. Like, you don't protect me neither. What you always tell me, I should go to the police. Why for? If this happens in the end, I don't want this. And that's really things that's an example of things we see every day. It's, we kind of try to make them trust into the institution, making them trust into saying that, you know, you are victims, you have rights, but in the end, these rights are not recognized, and it's like the whole work all over again. And so what you said, like helping helpers, it's also this. I mean, everyone gets tired of this situation because it's like, what are we fighting for? I mean, I'm young and sometimes I'm already tired of this situation because it's like, yeah, I mean, I have the impression they don't really respect people. They don't really care about the victim. They had their, I mean, the rapist was in prison, like French civil society is protected, but you undocumented migrants, please go home because actually we don't need you anymore.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
That's kind of the message for me.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. Please.
Just one sentence. I think we need to help the helpers, but we need the help of our politicians and of our institutions, of our laws, that we can do what I think the most important common values in the world are that we can protect human rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank the panel. If there are no other comments. Yeah, we are back to the beginning. We need politicians who care, and yeah, this is, there are not so many, let's say, yeah, but we will see, you know, we will nevertheless, the Regional Implementation Initiative, one of the aim is also to provide information and to make politicians to understand, you know, so, but it's a long and yeah, long process. So, thank you to everybody, of course, to all the panelists, to all the experts, but also to you, those who stayed. I would love to say next time we try to make it shorter, but I can't promise that, you know. So, but maybe, you know, we also learn, but there are so many pressing issues really at the same issue to look at. So thank you very much for everybody. I would also like to thank the technicians, you know, both Wolfgang and Lars. This was almost perfect, except only a little mistake, a little inconvenience with the video of the minister, but okay. No, so thank you very much. I'm just joking. This was really fine. And as I said before, we shall send you both maybe, you know, so because maybe getting an email, you would then quicker look at something. We would send you the contributions of of those who gave the introduction, and maybe to put other information at our webpage, everything available there. And please, again, let me say, this is a network. Just address the people if you wish to do something in your field, in your country, you know, just address them. They love it, they like it. These are the people we work with, and they want to do is they have a lot more experience than what they could provide here and what they heard because of limited of time. So thank you very much, and we will also ask them to come forward with a few important issues on ways forward. You know, we send you that, and next time, we see next time, maybe next year, you know, who knows. Thank you very much.